Hello and welcome to another edition of another book review. This week I'll be reviewing The Aftermath, The Last Days of the Baby Boom and the Future of Power in America by Philip Bump. I'll talk very briefly about the author, go into an overview of what the book is, talk about what I liked about it, what I didn't like about it, who I'd recommend the book to, and finish off with what I'll be reading for next time. Actually, I'll start with what I'll be reading for next time, just in case we have any non-U.S. listeners. This is a very U.S.-centric book, so I'm sure you may skip to the end. So just to give you a heads up, I will be reading 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, which I'm really looking forward to. So I know this is a very U.S.-centric book as far as The Aftermath goes, so just want to give you a heads up there so you know about that. Just to jump into The Aftermath by Philip Bump. Philip Bump is a reporter for the Washington Post. He typically covers the polling beat is what he does. And this is, to the best of my knowledge, his first book. What this book is about is mostly centered around the baby boomers, so the generation of people who were born in the United States after World War II. It covers the history of the baby boom, how everything really changed with them, the characteristics of boomers in terms of the fact that they tend to be more Caucasian, more religious, less likely to have a college degree. And he kind of draws the contrast with generations after, specifically millennials, but also Gen Z. And then he kind of finishes off with what he sees happening politically in the United States after the boomers are unable to wield what has been up to this point a lot of political power. He kind of goes into the history of, I think there's four boomer presidents, Clinton, Bush 2, Obama, and Trump, I think, are the four boomer presidents, and kind of using their story to illustrate certain things about the boomer generation, and then kind of talking about the kind of what he sees as the political fight between boomers and millennials, because you have one group of people, millennials, who are not as large as boomers, but they are kind of slowly growing into the age where they're going to wield more and more political power as the boomers do age. So I thought it was an interesting concept, and it was something I thought really struck me with the book. He has a lot of graphs in the book. I thought to borrow the phrase from Ian Bremmer, the Thucydides trap, I'm sure I mispronounced that, but the idea that you have one rising power, one falling power in terms of the numbers, I thought was kind of an interesting premise for the book that I don't think he uses to the degree I wish he had, but I'll get to that in a little bit. But so that kind of idea between the fight between boomers and millennials I thought was interesting. Philip Bump uses a lot of graphs in this book. There's probably over 100 graphs in the book. And one of the things he does is with each of the graphs, he has a little section that says how to read this graph. And I wish every book had this, because it made understanding the information he was trying to convey a lot easier to understand of what he was doing. So I really appreciated that. I think that the best part, my favorite part of the book, was when he went to talk about the general fault lines in certain real drastic aspects. So in terms of the rising cost of college and the rising cost of housing, whereas in the past housing was relatively inexpensive. We've seen housing starts in the United States collapse in the last, not collapse, but decreased pretty dramatically in the last 50 years. And the political ramifications of that in the fight between baby boomers and millennials in order to hopefully figure that out in a way that works for both groups of people. I really enjoyed that. He goes down to the Villages, which is a place I've actually been to. As strange as it sounds in the book, it's even stranger if you've been there. The Village is a very, very large community, and retirement community in Florida. He goes down there and interviews some people down there, and I thought that was a nice little touch. If there's something I enjoyed the parts of it's really the history of the baby boomers, really getting the sense of how everything really changed with the generation, how they basically added almost 50% of the population at the time. There's just a huge explosion of people that was spurred on really by pretty drastic prosperity coming out of the Second World War, where you had the manufacturing bases of Europe and Asia decimated. And so wages were on the rise, and college education was on the rise as part of, due to in large part to the GI Bill So there was a sense of, I think, shared prosperity for a lot of Americans, that folks were able to really take advantages of a lot of these programs that were available in order to secure a relatively successful future for their children, those children being the baby boomers. And so how the baby boomers are used to being really the center of the world and center of culture, teenage culture really started with them. So the chapter on culture I thought was pretty interesting as well. It's pretty brief, but I thought that was an interesting chapter as well. So I did enjoy all those things. There's a lot of asides in the book and a lot of digressions, and I think a lot of those things could be cut. As much as I enjoyed the graphs, I think you could have cut probably half the graphs, because I think they just kind of padded the book. I think he tries oftentimes to say the same thing 3 or 4 different ways, and you could just probably say that one way. He has, for instance, a digression on the death industry, this worry that we're not going to have enough space for the boomers. I thought you could have kind of cut that. He also kind of has a pretty strong editorial voice in the book, and I found that to be quite annoying at times. He, for an example, he says, and millennials didn't even know what Woodstock was, not even Woodstock, and some of that stuff was really quite annoying. My biggest issue with the book really was the last third of the book. After he kind of talks about the history of boomers, and he some of the points he reiterates kind of time and time again. He says probably in half a dozen different ways that the boomers are more white, more Caucasian than future generations, and he kind of just, it's a piano player only knows one note, kind of keeps hitting it, and just kind of lets you know that that's true again and again and again. And I think he does that in part because the last half of the book, or probably the last half or third of the book, is really about what's going to happen after the boomers don't have the political power. And he gets into this long kind of conversation about Trump and what Trump means for the future of the country. There's a lot of Trump in this book, so if you're someone who is maybe Trumped out, don't want to read anything with Trump, I think my feeling of reading this book was that Philip had a pretty healthy chunk on the baby boom that he wanted to write, but he also had a lot that he wanted to write on the future of the country politically and what Trump meant for the country, and he kind of combined those two things together, because it does at times feel like a book that's kind of sewn together, and it feels like there's times where the boomers are really essential to the story. There's other times where they're just not important at all, and it did feel disjointed for me because of that. The second half is about him going into, well, what does it mean if we have a changing demographic of the country in terms of race? Is the feelings that our racial identity is going to change? Are people who are biracial or multiracial more going to identify with white and then more likely to be Republicans, or are they more likely to view themselves as Democrats? Will people who are young today view themselves as Democrats in the future? And so he kind of goes through all these questions that we really don't know the answers to. And that's a really, really long section of the book. It just goes on and on and on. And, in reading this, I got the sense that Norm Ornstein is a gentleman who's on Diane Reham's show all the time. I got the sense that Philip and Norm Ornstein had similar politics. So a lot of the things I tried not to criticize too much, but I found myself saying, well, that's kind of true, or that's kind of not true, really, Philip, and there could be an asterisk that. So there are parts in that, too, where I was kind of annoyed at times where I felt like he told half of a story, or he exaggerated the truth, or undercut someone's feelings about someone by not kind of bringing in a fuller account of what the truth was. So I found those things to be more annoying, and I found the second half a lot less enjoyable than the first half, and I felt like I was really struggling to get through it. There was also part of it was there was not really anything that I hadn't thought about before, and it felt like a real long, unnecessary kind of collection of things that I had already thought about or read in other places. And so, if you're sitting someone who maybe hadn't thought about, what's going to happen if climate change puts a big wrench into South Florida and it scrambles politically what the country looks like, if you're someone who hasn't thought about, whether or not Hispanics will continue to mostly lean Democratic, but what happens if that split becomes closer to what it is for Caucasians or white people, which is like a 50-50 split between Democrats and Republicans? What will that look politically? If you're someone who hadn't thought about any of those things, he writes about a paragraph on each of those things. And so if that's something that's interesting to you, I do like the people that he did interview. He does cite Robert Putnam, Bob Putnam, on Bowling Alone. I thought that was good. He does Bill Bishop. What I was really happy to see, Bill Bishop was actually interviewed directly, so he mentions the big sword a couple times, but he actually also interviews Bill Bishop for his thoughts on people kind of self-selecting and self-sorting, which I thought was interesting. But yeah, I mean, overall, I was just kind of okay with this book. I guess the part of it that I liked the most, again, was kind of the part where there was these issues and you had multiple sides of the issues. I do wish there was more of a there's less of a knee-jerk reaction to just kind of call the boomers racist. I felt in reading this that he wanted to say, they're all racist. And I wish there had been something of like interviewing people to explain why they may be less favorable towards immigration than they seem to be. He doesn't really do any examination of that in a real way that I thought was maybe unfair. If you're talking about a generation of millions of people, I was kind of bothered by that. I'll put a link below to White Shift, because I think that book actually does do a good job of maybe examining some of that stuff. I'll put that link below. It's a book I've read in the past. So that was a little incomplete. And considering how much of the book is really about some of those things, I wish he had maybe tried harder on that. But overall, if you're interested in the baby boom generation, I think you'll like the first half of this book. If you're someone who really does not want to read anything else that involves Donald Trump whatsoever, a large chunk of the book is Donald Trump based. And I could see how that would bother a lot of people. And so just be forewarned on that. He does a good job. As far as his prose writing is fine. I think he does do a good job of bringing in different credible sources to tell the story he's telling. But overall, I was just kind of mixed on it. I thought it could have been better. And I don't think the book that I wanted to read was here. And I felt the book that I got was a little long and felt disjointed. So that's Philip Bump. Again, next time I'm going to be reading Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude. Maybe a couple weeks. Until next time, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and until next time, bye.